So hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Angela Burrow. I am on the board of the Wildlife Society Habitat Restoration Working Group. And the Habitat Restoration Working Group provides a forum for TWS members to share their experiences, techniques, and information relative to restoring wildlife populations in degraded habitats. The working group meets monthly to plan activities and actions. We welcome all members and we regularly solicit feedback from them. Some of our regular activities include organizing comments or statements on relevant policy or management actions, organizing the annual symposium at the annual meeting. Most recently, we have our upcoming symposium at the annual meeting titled Rewilding and Landscape Scale Ecosystem Restoration, a Wildlife Perspective. If you're attending the annual meeting, we do hope to see you there and at our working group annual meeting. Also, as part of the annual meeting, we offer scholarship and travel awards, whether you're presenting or not presenting. So that application is currently open until September 1st and accessible via the working group website, which you can find if you just go to the main Wildlife Society website. We also sponsor programs such as this webinar. If you'd like to connect, please reach out to us on our website, on Facebook, or via email. And you can also add the Habitat Restoration Working Group to your TWS membership when you renew. And I have the honor to present Dr. Schmitz. Dr. Schmitz is the Oastler Professor of Population and Community Ecology at the Yale School of the Environment. His work aims to make sense of nature's complexity arising from the interdependencies and eco-evolutionary interactions among the diversity of carnivore, herbivore, plant, and decomposer species within ecosystems. His research resolves the rules of life that explain how interdependencies vary in time and space, and what they mean for ecosystem nutrient cycling, carbon storage, and resiliency to global change. His work informs environmental ethics and stewardship to enhance animal conservation, to sustain ecosystems, their functions, and services they provide to humankind. At Yale, he teaches courses on the role of humans in nature and how humans can coexist harmoniously with nature. He currently provides scientific support to the Global Rewilding Alliance's effort to link animal conservation to carbon uptake and storage in ecosystems. This is called Animating the Carbon Cycle. Dr. Schmitz.
Thank you very much, Angela. Let me get the presentation going. And then, where are we? View, slideshow. Okay. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to give a presentation on it's a new idea. It hasn't been widely proven yet. It's a frontier in scientific research, and but I think it's exciting because doing some calculations and preliminary assessments suggests that there's a lot of promise in pursuing this avenue of scientific research as well as conservation practice. I'm going to give a presentation, I think, hopefully around 45 minutes, and then leave some time for Q&A afterward. Before I get into, the nuts and bolts of what I'm going to talk about, let's just really just recap the fundamental issue that we have to face here in terms of animating the carbon cycle, or even just what we're trying to do to arrest climate change. What I have here is an illustration of sort of a cartoon of the atmospheric CO2 buildup over time since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that's what we're trying to deal with right now. It's the legacy of the CO2 emissions, mainly CO2 emissions, but also methane emissions and other pollutants in the atmosphere that cause greenhouse gas warming. And we've seen an acceleration of that throughout history. The Paris Climate Agreement at the COP at Paris, they negotiated to decarbonize the economy by 2050. What that means is they plan to have net zero CO2 emissions to the atmosphere by 2050. But the problem is, even if we reach net zero by 2050, or even tomorrow, we still have about 500 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is 500 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is a legacy of the buildup since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So what we really need to do is address this issue of the legacy 500 gigatons of CO2, because if we don't, we will still blow through 2 degrees C of warming on the planet, even though we might reach net zero emissions. That is, we're stopping emissions, but we still have a legacy that could heat the planet. And so what we really need to strive for is come up with ways of sucking that CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it on the planet. That is, what we need to do is enhance the Earth's carbon dioxide sink strengths. And we call that negative CO2 emissions, right? Because we're taking it out of the atmosphere into the planet, and that's why it's negative, not positive to the atmosphere. And if we can do that, there is a hope that we can keep global warming below 2 degrees C. So how do we enhance the Earth's sink strengths? This is what's called natural climate solutions as one set of solutions. So there are technology solutions that people have proposed, right? Scrubbing atmospheric CO2 with technology, and then storing it in physical places, that are created, like deep wells of abandoned mines or whatever. But there is also nature that we can rely on, and what we have to do is think about enhancing natural climate solutions or nature-based climate solutions. And this is where restoration and rewilding and conservation really comes in. If we're mindful of conservation with an aim to enhance the Earth's sink strengths, then there's sort of a win-win for conservation, restoration, and mitigating climate change. What we need to do, though, if in a reasonable amount of time between now and 2100, we need to start now if we want to do this, because we're certainly not going to reach net zero emissions by 2050 the way things are going on this planet. But we can still, do the other side and really start drawing out CO2 out of the atmosphere. And to get rid of that legacy 500 gigatons, we need to suck out about 6 to 7 gigatons per year between now and 2100 over the next 75 years. That will get that legacy out of the atmosphere. That assumes we reach net zero, right? If we don't reach net zero, there'll still be more that we have to suck out. But the argument is, let's assume we're going to reach net zero, then the additional work we need to do is get another 6 to 7 gigatons out of the atmosphere every year. Now, there are a lot of nature-based or natural climate solutions that have already been proposed, and there's been a lot written about that. And there are 2 strategies that people have suggested that collectively actually help us achieve the goal of negative emissions. So part of it is protecting against the release of atmospheric CO2. That is, protecting those ecosystems that are already there and functioning and that are healthy. And let's not exploit those. Let's protect them and make sure that they can still function and capture CO2. And between this, this is what we call avoided emissions. So we prevent the emissions by protecting forests, protecting wetlands, protecting grasslands, and maybe changing our management of timberlands and grasslands a little bit. Together, that comes up to an avoidance of 5 gigatons, okay? But that's part of the, if we didn't do that, we would have to have a bigger problem. We would have to suck up even more. So the other side of the coin is enhancing sink strength, right? And right now, given everything that people have sort of looked at, that is managing croplands better, managing forests, managing livestock, restoring forests, afforesting, protecting wetlands and restoring wetlands. And all of that activity right now, if we were ambitious, could get us another 5 gigatons, right? Of enhanced capture. So we can avoid emissions, but we can also enhance emissions by 5 gigatons. Now, remember, I said we need to suck up 6 to 7 between now and 2100. And so there's an annual 1 to 2 gigaton per year shortfall. Now, the thing is, what's conspicuous here is that there's only one picture of an animal here, and that's a livestock, a domesticated animal. What about wild animals, right? They don't even figure into the calculus. Nobody even thinks about wild animals in this story. And part of the reason is because animals have presumed not to be abundant enough to make an impact on the carbon cycle. So if you go to Ecology 101 and learn about ecosystem science and the pyramid of life and pyramid of biomass, we know, and this is an ecological fact, an ecological rule, if you, in terrestrial systems especially, if you were to calculate how much biomass or measure how much biomass there was in plant trophic level, in the herbivore trophic level, in the carnivore trophic level, what you would find is you get a pyramid of biomass or numbers, because the vegetation is orders of magnitude higher than the things that eat the vegetation. And those things are order of magnitude higher than the meat eaters, the carnivores that eat the herbivores. But the problem is that's only half of the story or less than half the story, because there are also feedbacks that these animals have. And these feedbacks are currently not really appreciated and accounted for. And what that means is even though the animals are present, their feedback effects and what they do to these bigger biomass pools, and I include soils here or sediments where you also have huge biomass of microbes and also organic carbon. These animals can have disproportionate impacts on these larger pools by virtue of their interaction, not necessarily the present, but their interaction with these larger pools. Now, again, when people think of animals, they think of, okay, there's a certain amount of biomass carbon that the animals hold, but that's going to be way too small to suck up all of that, 1 to 2 gigatons per year more than what's already being taken up. There's not enough room on the planet. There's not enough energetic efficiency on the planet for these animals to really make a difference in terms of biomass carbon storage. They do contribute to the carbon cycle, though, through respiration, just like soils and plants do, but that's also a minuscule amount, right? And so most of the action is really in the plant and soil realm, and the animals release a little bit. But again, because of this pyramid of biomass, people have assumed, no, animals aren't going to work. But that's absolutely the wrong way to think about it, because it turns out what the animals do in terms of their foraging and in terms of their recycling feedback as part of the story, they can fundamentally change these biomass pools here in the plant and the soil sea storage, and that's where they're going to have their dramatic impact. And there are several mechanisms that they can do that by. And they're pretty uniform, so it's either foraging or through nutrient deposition or disturbance or organic carbon deposition or seed dispersal. And all of those, these several ways that the animals can impact transcend everything from the high tundra to the deepest ocean. All animals do these kinds of things in their respective ecosystems, except maybe in the marine realm, there isn't much seed dispersal in the deep ocean, but certainly there is in salt marshes, seagrasses, kelp forests, and coral reefs. Okay. So animals, there's a unifying principle here. There's a common mechanism among all animals across ecosystems. Let me give you several examples of how that might happen and why animals are important. So let's go to the higher Arctic as a start. And what you have, let's suppose you don't have large vertebrates like caribou and muskoxen up in the high Arctic. What you get is a proliferation of shrubs in the Arctic tundra. And the shrubs grow and they grow high. And also what you have in the winter is that you have a high snowpack, the snow falls. And what it does is it insulates the permafrost, but it insulates it to keep the summer temperatures or the summer effects warm, so it doesn't cool down. So if you have really cold winter air here, it doesn't necessarily penetrate the permafrost because the deep snow acts as an insulation barrier to keep that soil warm or that permafrost warm. And so what happens is you start getting organic the permafrost melting and the organic carbon being decomposed by microorganisms. But also when you have the spring, when you start getting spring and summer, the solar radiation comes in, it hits the shrubs and it gets absorbed, and that heat gets transmitted to the permafrost and also adds to the melting. Okay, and what happens is that this ice wedge, the frozen permafrost carbon, melts, the ice melts, and so you have organic carbon here that is exposed and it gets decomposed. And because this is a moist environment, you get an anaerobic decomposition of this organic carbon, and it gets released as methane. Now, methane on a short time horizon can be 78 times more potent than CO2 in terms of its heat trapping capacity. So that's a big worry if we start to see the high Arctic permafrost start to melt. What these animals do, though, is they consume those shrubs, right? So they keep the vegetation low. So you've got your grasses and sedges and mosses that are protected by these animals here. And then also they trample the snowpack so that you get a very thin layer. And so the cold air can penetrate the soil surface and therefore keep the permafrost frozen. On top of that, in the spring, there are no shrubs to impede the solar radiation, so you get reflection. And that's the albedo effect. The solar radiation gets reflected back to the atmosphere. So even though these animals might not be highly abundant in terms of the carbon that they store, they can have a huge impact on, the frozen organic carbon that's stored in the high Arctic. In grassland ecosystems, prairie grasslands, if you don't have these animals present, you certainly do get plant production and you get recycling, but it's slow recycling of organic matter and nutrients, and microbial breakdown of that releases nitrogen so that you get a complete nitrogen cycle and productivity. But these animals, through their grazing, and again, the grasses tend to be adapted to herbivory and respond to herbivory. So these animals can actually stimulate the productivity of grasslands. And likewise, because of their urine that they release, it's already a fertilizer in inorganic form. So it can actually bypass the need for microbial decomposition and actually speed up nitrogen cycling. And therefore, you get a much more productive grassland. And because that grassland's more productive, production derives from photosynthesis. You get more photosynthetic uptake of carbon dioxide and a lot more organic matter buildup, and that then ends up in the soil for soil storage. So again, these animals might not be highly abundant relative to the vegetation on the plain, but their interactions with the vegetation can actually speed up and increase the amount of carbon that can be captured. In forest ecosystems, boreal forest ecosystems, in the absence of wolves, let's say, what you have is you have moose foraging, and moose prefer certain vegetation types like fast-growing aspen, and sometimes they eat some spruce. And so what these moose do is they open the canopy up a little bit, and so you get solar radiation coming in and warming the soil surface, and so you get decomposition of an otherwise very cool forest floor. And that sort of speeds up microbial decomposition of the organic matter that's stored in the soil. Also, their herbivory and their CO2 release, you get less organic matter hitting the soil surface. And so you get a high release of CO2. With wolves present, controlling moose abundances, what you end up getting is a much more luxuriant forest regrowth and forest development, stand development. The soil stays cool, and you get a lot of slower carbon cycling in the soil. Most of it gets stored in the cool soil as organic carbon. Again, these animals are not very abundant compared to all of the trees, but their interactions and the way the wolves might change the moose of population densities, but also their foraging interactions with the trees can fundamentally change the soil carbon capture and storage. In tropical systems, what you have is canopy trees tend to be the carbon densest trees, and they also produce big fruits and big seeds of fruit, big seeded fruits. So you need a lot of large vertebrates to disperse the seeds in these systems. What happens is in the tropical forest, we've seen this happen, is there's defaunation. These animals are being reduced in abundance because of overhunting or fragmentation of the landscape. And so the loss of these herbivores actually leads to the loss of these dense canopy forest trees because their seed dispersers are gone or largely diminished. And so you store less carbon in this kind of system when the animals are absent than when they're present. The other advantage is with these animals, they actually have the seeds are released in dung piles. So these are actually piles of nutrients that promote germination and then the production of these trees. Plus, their urine release leads to fast nutrient cycling in a soil that's really nutrient poor. And so together, these animals actually promote the production of large canopy, carbon dense trees. And so they can really boost the amount of carbon in tropical forests. So, how large is the animal effect? How important are animals? So we've been able to actually get some information based on scientific studies that have been done, classic studies. And these included wildebeest in the Serengeti, wildebeest that were almost lost to rinderpest, but they have recovered, and people were able to account for how much carbon now the Serengeti actually holds, given their restoration and the population rebound. But also we've done calculations for what wolves do in terms of controlling moose populations in the boreal forest. There have been work done now on tigers throughout Southeast Asia in forests where they're present versus complementary forest types, but they've been extirpated by humans. The sea otter, everybody knows the sea otter restoration story, and there's a carbon story there. Muskox in the high Arctic, marine fish, people have calculated marine fish, and then sharks on coral reefs specifically. And so if you add all of these amounts up, it comes to 5.96 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Okay, so that's 5 billion tons. That is part of these protected intact lands or oceans, if you will. Also, most of it is in the ocean. So the ocean doesn't even figure into this calculation. 5.6, 4.4. So somewhere we're not accounting fully for what animals are doing. But the other problem is in these kinds of systems here, we only assume that the plants matter, right? So we'll let the animals go if they get overhunted. So what? Well, if we do that, these animals can contribute significantly to that. So we might lose that. But because we're not accounting for it, we're not measuring that, we're actually enabling people to, overhunt or extirpate animals, like culling wolves in the boreal forest so we can protect, other species, killing tigers or hunting tigers for their body parts and things like that. Or even people have proposed culling sea otters because of the abalone fishery is being jeopardized by them. And so, we got to think about wildlife conservation hand in hand with protecting intact lands. And we're just learning this now. And we do have time to change our ways, but we really need to do that. And this carbon story tells us that, right? But this isn't not being accounted for right now. In terms of enhanced sinks, though, on the other side of the story, people have looked at the restoration of forest elephants in the Congo Basin, come up with a number, what they do within their home range in that region, bison in the American West. And this is just an estimate for what bison could do in 25% of their historical range. Just those parts of the range where there is little or limited conflict with humans and livestock herding. And then there are beaver globally, and then there are sperm whales and baleen whales in the Southern Ocean. And again, this, it's 0.78 billion tons. It's approaching 1 to 2 gigatons of the shortfall that we have already. These are just a few species. It's the tip of the iceberg in terms of species that we might consider. And so, these restoration numbers, the reason I put these numbers up here is because they're on the same scale as what people are talking about in terms of global scale nature-based climate solutions, but it's also numbers on a scale that IPCC is working at. And the beauty of this is that these are regional effects. They're not necessarily global effects. So people, these animals are in people's backyards, metaphorically speaking. And so, each country has wildlife species that they can work with and actually steward and restore and maintain those populations. And again, this is just a global map of where all of these assessments were done. There are policy implications here, right? So part of the Paris Climate Agreement was that countries would do their nationally determined contributions and come up with action plans for meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so part of that is really doing an inventory and an accounting of the sources and amounts of CO2 and methane, or greenhouse gases actually, that are released by different activities. And people have really looked at agriculture sector, obviously oil and gas, commercial activities, electric generation, industrial, et cetera, but nowhere do they actually think about the contributions from nature or the contributions from nature and animals. And so these aren't actually done as part of this accounting here. And so we're leaving things on the table. And as you can see, these numbers are in the billions of tons if we add it up over all the countries. And that means they are huge. But what do they mean from a country level? So let's go back. Let's think about the Serengeti wildebeest. What the wildebeest do in terms of carbon storage, capture and storage, and how they stimulate that by their grazing activity and trampling and everything, they add an equivalent of 28% of the total fossil fuel emissions by Tanzania. Their contribution, that is, in their absence, there would be 28% more fossil fuel emissions than in their presence. It's a huge amount. Okay, sharks and coral reefs across the world, the amount of carbon that they contribute to storing is the equivalent of what Kuwait emits each year. So these are offsets in a sense, but I don't want us to think of these as offsets because we still need to reach net zero. Okay, we can't do this without reaching net zero to arrest climate change. Sea otters, 8% of the total greenhouse gas emissions by British Columbia. That's what they actually lead to sequestering of. In the gray wolves in the boreal forest of Canada, it's 47% of all of the fossil fuels emitted by Canada. Muskox, circumpolar Arctic, 75% of the fossil fuel CO2 emissions of Norway. Marine fish, and most of it is in the mesopelagic, which is not being fished yet. That's below, it's in the lower level of the ocean under the light zone. That's where most of the fish biomass on this planet is, but it's not harvested. But people are thinking of harvesting that now because they've overfished the shoreline fisheries or the inshore fisheries. Now, that amount is twice the total fossil fuel emissions by the EU and Africa. So that's a huge amount, and it's not being accounted for anywhere in IPCC accounting or global accounting. African forest elephants in the Congo Basin. Again, as I said, if we can restore them, these are big numbers. These are country level numbers or more than what the countries admit. And then the American bison alone, 12% of the fossil fuel CO2 emissions of the USA could get stored in prairie grasslands. That's the equivalent of what the Plains states emits every year, that 12%. So the American bison could offset it, but again, I don't want us to think of these as offsets. We have to think about these as in addition to reaching net zero. Now, there's a caveat though, right? This isn't always a rosy picture. Animals also can have negative effects, and it's just part of their ecology. And so when there are negative effects, that could be a decrease, a one-fold to almost a 10-fold decrease in carbon storage relative to the conditions where animals are absent. This is either from experimental research or field surveys, okay? And likewise, in terms of enhancing the carbon sink, it can be 12 times more, in some cases down to maybe 1.5 times more. But these are significant numbers, right? Like in the absence of the animals, we store much less carbon than in their presence. And these are just, people who have done studies, field studies, measured carbon in different places, where the animals are present relative to similar conditions where the animals are absent. These animals are having a huge impact. These animal effects are hidden in plain sight. And so if they're not quantified, they won't be managed or conserved. And so what we've done in terms of our research is developed a new carbon cycle that actually builds in the role of animals and quantifies the animal effects. So it's basically the plants and soils is the classic carbon cycle model where it accounts for photosynthesis, plant respiration, plant recycling, soil processes, and it does it in terms of carbon and nitrogen dynamics because, again, the carbon cycle model recognizes that nitrogen or phosphorus or limiting nutrients limit how much carbon can be taken up by plants. So it has to be explicitly in terms of carbon and nitrogen. So we've added the herbivore impacts, include their respiration, but we also include their recycling effects, right? Their carbon in dung and their nitrogen in urine. And likewise, the predators in the system. And so by integrating animals and plants, what we're doing is we're accounting certainly for the carbon and biomass of all of these components of the ecosystem, but more importantly, we're addressing these feedback effects and quantifying these feedback effects and what they mean. And you can get data from the literature to parameterize these models to come up with a first approximation of the feasibility of what these animals can do. And we've done several case studies. So the first would be restoration of European bison in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. And so you can get data for soil and vegetation in Carpathian grasslands, and you can get data on consumption rates and metabolic rates and recycling rates by European bison. And if you do the modeling, what you find is that in this region here, where we focused on in the Tarku Mountains, the restoration of European bison can lead to 1.6 times more carbon taken up in that grassland ecosystem than in their absence. So the animals are boosting this. Did an analysis for a rewilding project in Chile in La Patagonia National Park. This park was established by turning a cattle ranch back into natural wilderness. And this is the Tompkins Foundation. Christine Tompkins was really instrumental in funding this, but it's really, the project is run by Rewilding Chile. And again, we looked at the interactions between puma and guanaco, which is a camel, and then camel related to vicuña and llamas and things like that. So guanaco, and then grassland vegetation and soil. And if you do the modeling and accounting for all of these interactions, what you find is that these animals can take up almost double, cause the ecosystem to take up almost double what the ecosystem would do without the animals. So that's a pretty significant amount of uptake, again. We've also done work for a sort of mixed scrubland forest, dry tropical forest in Mexico. And here we've made the model a little more complex, where we're looking at jaguars and pumas together feeding on their dominant prey, which are white-tailed deer and collared peccary. And these animals might mostly eat the shrub, but they also use the vegetation for thermoregulation. So they also release dung and urine in those parts of the ecosystem. Even though they don't eat in here, they can stimulate productivity and carbon storage in the dung and urine that they release. And when you account for those effects, what you find is those dry tropical forests could, across the dry tropical forest range in Mexico, lead to about 3.18 times more carbon stored in that ecosystem than without the animals. Elephants, again, in the Congo Basin, right? The elephants, they feed on the understory, they trample the understory, they change the competition with the overstory trees. They also release, fruits in that, or they consume fruits and release the seeds in the dung. And then through their dung also they contribute to carbon storage in the soil. When you model that dynamic, what you find is you can get about 1.77 times more carbon with these animals present than without in the Congo Basin region where they're restoring these animals. And so these modeling exercises are showing the promise. These aren't validated yet. We still have to do a lot of work to measure what happens when the animals are absent versus present, but we're getting much better at doing that. And it seems like, when we do it, the modeling is validated. And so what we really need to do is change a mindset in conservation and restoration. A lot of times we restore habitat with the hope that these animals will come. Maybe what we need to think about is we need to bring the animals to actually have the habitat come also. And so likewise with climate change, we commonly view climate change as causing collateral damage to biodiversity. That is, we think of animals as unwitting victims that are stuck on an ill-fated a ship that's on an ill-fated voyage. But the alternative view, the change in mindset, uh, the change in mindset sees animals as important drivers of the climate shift. And so what we can really promote here is biodiversity conservation through restoration and conservation can also help fix the climate change problem, potentially. Again, because of the negative effects that animals can have, we actually need to do more quantification of this, find out which animals have positive effects, which ones have negative effects. But there is promise to actually think of animal conservation as contributing and enhancing our ability to mitigate climate change. And so, these ideas are exciting to me because it offers hope, new hope that we can sort of deal with two problems head on this planet and try and fix both the biodiversity crisis and mitigate climate change at the same time. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to engage in discussion or questions that people might have.
Everyone, you should have the Q&A box down at the bottom, and you can put your questions in there. And I don't know, Oz, if you want me to read them as they come up, or if you want to read them out loud yourself, because I'm not sure if others can see them once they're posted. Give everyone a few minutes to think. Thank you so much for that. It's really exciting. And actually, I have a question while we're waiting. So I work in wetland systems.
Yeah.
So just wondering what kind of thoughts or work that you've done in wetland systems. I saw you mentioned beaver, but there's lots of other animals that can have pretty big impacts on wetlands. So just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah. So both positive and negative. So a lot of, the negative effects of the waterfowl. Waterfowl are actually not good. They're not conducive to storing carbon because they promote methane release from wetlands. So that's a case where, you shouldn't be pitching protecting wetlands and wildlife conservation at the same time. And we shouldn't also get rid of, waterfowl because they have a negative effect on the carbon cycle. It isn't always win-win, so we have to be careful there. But there are fish that live in wetlands also that eat methanogenic bacteria. And so what they end up doing is actually promoting carbon storage in wetlands because the bacteria that would normally break down the organic matter are less abundant. So it's again like the wolves, the moose, and the vegetation. This is fish, methanogenic bacteria, organic carbon in the wetlands. Beavers, it's a mixed story because the wetlands could still emit a lot of methane if it's a beaver swamp, but eventually these beaver swamps fill in over time because of succession and become wet meadows, and then those wet meadows become bogs, right? Peat bogs and things like that. And that's where you store a lot of carbon ultimately. So we have to protect that too.
Thank you.
So
All right.
question.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions in here.
Yeah.
Do you want to read them or you want me to
Yeah,
read them
I can
out?
read them. I can read them.
Okay,
So the
go
first
ahead.
question by Meredith is, what is the next direction for your research? Yeah, I want to validate these model predictions, but also part of we're trying to fundraise to develop a global hotspots map. So what we want to do is more modeling of more animals and really try and find those ecosystems globally where there's high potential and immediate high opportunity to do something. And actually think about strategically, informing where we can have some low-hanging fruit in terms of initiating rewilding projects for animating the carbon cycle. So yeah, it's exciting, both the validation and the modeling side of things. Next question, Aaron, what are your thoughts on the recent gray wolf call in BC? This is always an interesting thing because hunters, want their game. People are worried about caribou, especially woodland caribou, and wolves decimating their populations of an already threatened species. But what we aren't accounting for is the role that wolves play in regulating these populations and the carbon consequences of it. And again, because we're not thinking about these animals in terms of their carbon contributions, this is the irony, we could exacerbate global warming, which would then contribute to the demise of these species by killing a predator that we think is going to cause the demise of these species. And so I think, what we have to become is much more sophisticated in our wildlife management and not just think about things at a population level. We actually have to think about the ecosystem consequences of manipulating wildlife populations. So, what I'm arguing for is a more holistic perspective in wildlife management and conservation as well. And there are other things that we can do to mitigate, especially in boreal Alberta. There are other things we could do to mitigate caribou declines potentially if we would have done our land use differently in terms of oil and gas development and that. But there are lessons to be learned from that. Thank you for that question. Would it be possible, this is from Megan, would it be possible to get a list of citations of research papers that were referenced in this talk? Yes, what I'll do is send Angela a URL to the Global Rewilding Alliance, or if you want to Google it, you can do it. You just type in Global Rewilding Alliance, Animating the Carbon Cycle, and all of the latest relevant literature is on that site. And it tells the whole story of what the Global Rewilding Alliance is doing for that. Okay, from Alicia, prescribed burning is being used to restore ecosystems and wildlife habitat. Do you have thoughts or do you know of research that looks at net carbon emissions between the short-term fire event and the long-term benefit of the restored habitat? The only work I know about that is not necessarily in terms of using fire as a management, but fire as a consequence. And a lot of that's in Africa, where they're looking also at wildlife and how wildlife might mitigate wildfire in terms of their browsing and grazing and whatnot. So the classic story, for example, in the Serengeti, is that the decimation of the wildebeest because of rinderpest led to 80% of the Serengeti burning every year. Okay, so there was all this ungrazed vegetation. It burnt every year. And it released all sorts of CO2. So the Serengeti was a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere. As these wildebeest rebounded to their historical levels, and that's 1.2 million animals, what we're seeing now is that the fires, it's a fire-driven system still, but only about 10 to 15% of the place burns now. The rest is eaten. The vegetation is eaten, and then it's incorporated as dung in the soil. So, what you have to do is think about if you've got a fire-prone ecosystem and you use burning to manage it, it may not necessarily have carbon benefits. What you have to do is make sure that the vegetation, when it regrows, actually becomes resistant to fire or have components of the restoration that make that resilient to fire, or else you're going to lose all the carbon gains that you've made. So that's something, again, to keep in mind. So how do waterfowl, from Andrew, how do waterfowl promote methane production? And would it be the same in saltwater wetland versus freshwater? Well, the answer for saltwater versus freshwater is yes, because it happens in the high Arctic as well as in freshwater prairie potholes. It's basically what you have is, because these animals defecate in the water, they nourish the water. Again, fast recycling, but you get promotion of algal production. And when that algal production dies, it's in the water column. And so bacteria break it down, but again, it's in anaerobic conditions. So it's methanogenic bacteria that actually decompose that organic matter and gets released as methane, not necessarily as CO2. Does this research cover soil-based plants regarding vegetation, or is there a way to include ocean plankton and fertilization? The whale story is the whale fertilization. So people have measured what they call the whale pump. So the whales go dive deep in the ocean. They feed on krill. They come to the surface waters to breathe. And as they're in the surface waters, they release plumes of nitrogen and iron. Iron's a really limiting nutrient in the ocean. In fact, the ocean is a really crappy place to take up and store carbon. It's just because of its vastness, it becomes really important. And so what the whales do is they stimulate production of phytoplankton in that light zone, the phototic zone. You know, the twilight zone that I talked about where the bulk of the fish are is below that zone. So in the light zone, that's where you get the plankton production and the carbon uptake and capture. Whales can contribute to that, but there's still a lot of controversy right now about how much whales contribute to that. So the jury's still out on whether whales are going to be super viable as some people are touting them. So stay tuned on that. That's an ongoing story. From Michelle, I'm interested in learning more and getting involved with this research. I'm involved in carbon capture research study of an artificial reef in the Gulf. Are there plans to expand more ocean fauna effects on carbon reduction? So part of our modeling effort, we have a collaborator who's, I'm a terrestrial ecologist, so a collaborator is working on marine systems, and so they're modeling those kinds of systems and really thinking about that. But I am doing a project right now to model dugong impacts on seagrass meadows in Bahrain with a collaborator in Bahrain. They want to use that information as part of their nationally determined contributions calculations. And so that's also being promoted by the International Fund for Animal Welfare. They're actually funding this study to do that. So there are efforts to do this, but again, you know, people have done a lot of work with mangroves and seagrasses and done a lot of the carbon dynamics there, but they haven't included the story of the animals in that. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. From Fabio, most bison herds in North America are small and confined to small prairie fragments. Do you think these small herds would also have a meaningful contribution? My argument is any contribution is meaningful. Okay, every little bit that we do contributes because you can add it up over the planet. And that's again why the regional solutions, why I like using animals. Animals can be used in your backyard. You can do things on your front lawn with arthropods, right? Spiders and grasshoppers or insects. It doesn't matter. These principles are scalable from invertebrates all the way to the large herbivores. And whatever little piece of property you have and what little you can do, it's going to contribute. It's going to add up. It's going to get the message out. It contributes to a holistic perspective on stewardship and restoration. So I would encourage anybody who has the opportunity to do something, even in a small fragment, to try and do it. Ray Deezer. Please describe one of the field studies you are doing to validate your modeling results. Well, I'm about to start a project in Manitoba, Canada, where it's in collaboration with Rewilding Canada. There's a rancher there. He's bought, or a rancher. He isn't a rancher really. He was a tax lawyer who bought ranch land, 100,000 acres of land, and he has restored 5,000 wild bison on that landscape. And so we're going to go there. He grazes them strategically. So there are places where they're not being grazed. There are places where they are being grazed. It's a tall grass, boreal parkland transition. So he's seeing that the bison are actually knocking back the tree encroachment of the boreal, promoting grassland, tall grass prairie. And so what we hope to do is go and systematically survey the carbon in places where they've been restored and where they're actually not been around. Again, case control study so that we can see and actually validate the model predictions. So that's one place. We have done some work with moose in Newfoundland, Canada, and we're writing up the results of that work already, where we've actually measured vegetation and soil carbon and also soil carbon flux in that landscape. So again, yeah, I'm ambitious, and hopefully I'd like to also work in the Tarku Mountains in Romania to do the European bison that we modeled. Thank you for that question. Brian, have you or any other researchers yet incorporated invertebrates, such as insect, in your carbon cycling models? Yes, I have. The inspiration for the model that I presented here was actually done. It was developed and tested with my study system that I work on, spiders and grasshoppers. So that work is published in two journals, Ecology and also in Ecology and Evolution. And so we've been actually able to predict how much more carbon gets stored, and do it pretty accurately, given the parameters that we were able to measure in the field. So yeah, one of the reasons why I was really optimistic about using this model and confident in its structure is that it has been tested out with the arthropod system. Okay.
All right. It looks like we don't have any open questions, but we still have about 8 minutes left. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type that into the Q&A. And while we're waiting, I'll give everyone a chance to think, but I'll mention that the Habitat Restoration Working Group, along with the Wildlife Society, has recently joined the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration as a partner organization. So if you're interested in joining that collaboration, which is just really getting going, chance to, work at a global level on climate change and restoration. Part of that is rewilding, as Oz has convinced me, and I'm sure convinced many of us. Please reach out, because we're forming those groups to work on those different pieces that are under that umbrella right now.
And to add to that, Angela, the UN Decade of Restoration has adopted animating the carbon cycle as part of a part of the portfolio. So you'll see it mentioned there too.
That's great to hear.
I think just for some food for thought, the classic restoration has always been the field of dreams idea. If you build it, they will come. And when we say they will come, it'll be animals. But I'm ascribing more to an alternative view that is, if they come, you will build it, right? So again, taking a more holistic perspective, it's not just sort of bottom up, building up the system. It's also including the top down effects. You can't restore a tropical forest if you don't have the frugivores. You have to have the frugivores there to actually rebuild the tropical forest trees. And so thinking about things in terms of both the bottom up, trying to establish vegetation, but also trying to bring back the animals so that they can integrate and be part of that cycle. That's sort of a new way of thinking of restoration. And in that sense, wildlife conservation becomes integral to restoration and then maybe a necessary component of restoration. So from Meredith, are there papers you have published that you would recommend to researchers interested in this area? Again, I would recommend you go to the Global Rewilding Alliance webpage and type in animating the carbon cycle in the search, and that'll pop up all of the relevant literature, not just my own, but also other studies that have popped up. Like there's a big tiger analysis that had been published in Global Change Biology, as well as some modeling restoring wolves in Scotland and what that means for carbon storage. So those stories are presented on that webpage, and that's where you can get really up-to-date information, because they have staff in place to actually update with the scientific content. So another question from Mikey. Your work put a large emphasis on rewilding. How readily do you think this can be applied to urban ecology as well, as in wilding cities? Again, when we talk about rewilding, it isn't just the large animals, right? It's also the arthropods, the insects, and thinking about insects and the functional analogs of that insects are to the large vertebrates. And if you think about that, like a grasshopper in a prairie grassland, a bison doesn't necessarily compete strongly with an elk. Actually, its stronger competitor is a bison analog grasshopper because they eat the same vegetation. And then there's another grasshopper that eats the same vegetation as elk. And so there's a replication of that, trophic structure. If you have bison, elk, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, mule deer, etc., going all the way down to gophers or whatever, you've got a parallel structure in terms of body size differences and foraging strategies in the grasshopper community there. And so they are functional analogs. So you can quickly do things in urban areas without bringing in the scary beasts that, freak people out, and actually do things in your backyard with arthropods. But you got to think about them as functional, not just by species. And you can get a lot of things done that are really cool.
Got just a couple more minutes. So if you have a burning question, please post it now, or you'll have to email Dr. Schmitz.
Mary quickly asks, is there a carbon debt associated with rewilding, or is it more of a build it and they will come? It's more, at least now, the way we're looking at it, it's more of a, if we build it, they will come. Courtney, a complicated question, but what would you say to those who state we shouldn't have to speak about the carbon benefits of rewilding to justify wildlife conservation efforts? Again, it always comes down to that. But the thing is, if, as I showed with the avoided emissions, these animals are part of the avoided emissions. So we actually have to think holistically. And if we don't think about protecting animals and their conservation, we could actually jeopardize existing nature-based climate solutions. But on the other hand, also, as I said, animals can have negative effects. So what we have to do is a sober analysis and actually declare what our values are. Are they for wildlife or are they for ecosystem management? I'm of a perspective, and my values are for ecosystem management rather than just specific wildlife species necessarily. And so that's sort of the lens I'm presenting here. But there's nothing wrong with just justifying wildlife conservation in terms of wildlife species and making sure that these living, wonderful beings, sentient beings, are part of our world. That's an important dimension, and it shouldn't be forgotten. And also the people that steward the land, we can't displace them, and we have to think about them. So that's where we need to go with a lot of this. So it's an important question, and it's a really important philosophical question. An anonymous attendee. In the private sector, there's often a financial limitation what we can apply in our restoration projects. We have to see some kind of return or cost-saving strategy. Wildlife are often a secondary benefit. Could you speak how we might rationalize implementing this approach to mitigation sites? Again, there's a whole field now of biodiversity credits, but it's the finance there is minimal compared to the carbon credits. And so I think in terms of carbon finance, so one of the problems I think with a lot of conservation right now, it's still philanthropic. So people give money, hope the project goes, but the project doesn't get sustained because people run out of interest in the project. They're moving their philanthropy to something else. So what my view is that if we truly want to have nature as part of our systems, we actually have to figure out how nature can be self-sustaining in terms of all of the ecosystem services, not just carbon, in terms of all of the ecosystem services and health benefits they provide to humans. But then as part of stewardship, we actually have to think about what do we give back to ecosystems to make sure they stay in a sustainable way. And so if we think about funding mechanisms to pay people to steward nature through maybe carbon finance, maybe carbon off or biodiversity offsets or biodiversity finance, or whatever sort of ecosystem service that's available, I think what we're doing is we're free riding on nature a little too much right now. And so we do have to think about the economic value of that natural capital and actually pay people on the land that are preserving that right now that we're free riding, and actually pay them the true value of their service to us in terms of stewarding and protecting nature also.
We are out of time now. I do want to respect Dr. Schmitz's time. There's a few questions in the chat. I'll send those over to you via email, Dr. Schmitz. But we'll go ahead and close now
Okay.
to keep your time.
These are
And
all great
thank you.
questions, though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
wonderful and great conversation. So I appreciate that. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your time.